Let me tell you something real tonight, something nobody teaches you when your heart is involved. Love doesn't break people. Attachment without self-respect does. And many women don't lose men because they care too much. They lose themselves while trying to be understood. You see, when you talk, explain, beg, remind, or prove, what you're really saying is, please see my value. And the truth is, value is never recognized when it's being advertised. It's recognized when it's missed. This message is not about manipulation. It's not about games. It's not about revenge. This is about emotional intelligence. Because there is one thing, just one, that when done correctly shifts power without force, awakens emotion without pressure, and creates longing without effort. And when that happens, he won't cry because you left. He'll cry because he finally feels what you carried alone. When emotional access is removed, something powerful begins to happen inside the human mind, especially for a man who has grown used to your presence, your voice, your emotional availability, your reassurance. Emotional absence is not emptiness, it is space, and space forces reflection. This is where most people misunderstand silence. They think silence is weakness, punishment, or retreat. In reality, silence, when rooted in self-respect, is an invitation for the other person to finally sit alone with their own thoughts. When you are always explaining how you feel, always clarifying your intentions, always trying to fix misunderstandings, you unknowingly remove the need for the other person to think. You do the emotional labor for both of you. The mind stays comfortable because it doesn't have to work. But the moment that emotional access disappears, the comfort is gone. The brain hates unanswered questions. It seeks closure. It searches for meaning. And when there is no emotional noise to distract it, it turns inward. This is where reflection begins. A man does not immediately feel lost the moment you pull back. At first, he feels relief from responsibility, relief from expectation, relief from accountability. And many women panic at this stage because they mistake that relief for indifference. It is not indifference. It is the calm before awareness. Emotional realization does not arrive loudly. It arrives slowly, quietly, often late at night when distractions are gone. When you stop being emotionally available, the mind starts replaying moments it once ignored. Conversations, laughter, the way you listened without interrupting, the way you stayed even when it was hard. The value that was once constant becomes noticeable only in its absence. This is basic psychology. The brain registers loss more intensely than presence. What was always there never felt urgent. What is gone suddenly feels important. And here's the key. Reflection does not come from confrontation. It comes from contrast. When your emotional energy is gone, the contrast between with you and without you becomes unavoidable. He begins to notice the silence where your care used to be, the peace where your reassurance once lived, the absence where your effort once stood. This reflection is uncomfortable. It brings questions he was avoiding. Questions like, why doesn't she chase anymore? Why does the house feel quieter? Why does nobody check on me the way she did? Why does this feel heavier than I expected? These questions are not about missing attention. They are about missing impact. Silence forces accountability without accusation. There is no argument to win, no defense to prepare, no blame to deflect. There is only space, and space does not lie. In that space, he begins to examine his behavior, not because you demanded it, but because his own mind demands answers. This is why emotional absence is so powerful. It removes resistance. People resist pressure, not reflection. When you step back with dignity, you are no longer chasing validation. You are no longer asking to be chosen. You are allowing reality to speak for itself, and reality speaks loudest in silence. He begins to connect dots he never connected before. He realizes the effort you made that he took for granted, the patience he never thanked you for, the emotional safety he assumed would always be there. And here's the part most people don't understand. Reflection hurts more than confrontation. Confrontation allows defense. Reflection allows truth. There is no one to argue with when you are alone with your thoughts at night. no message to ignore, no voice to dismiss, just memory, just awareness, just realization. This is where the emotional weight starts to settle in, not as panic, but as a slow, heavy understanding. He starts to feel the cost of emotional neglect, the cost of inconsistency, the cost of assuming you would always stay. And this feeling doesn't come with logic. It comes with emotion, that tightness in the chest, that restlessness at night, that urge to reach out and not knowing why. He may not even be able to name what he's feeling. That's the thing. Men often don't cry because they can explain their pain. They cry because they feel something they didn't expect. Emotional absence creates emotional confusion, and confusion leads to longing, not longing for control, but longing for what felt real. This is why chasing never works. Chasing fills the space that reflection needs. Explaining fills the silence where realization could grow. When you stop talking, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect, you stop interrupting his emotional process. You let the mind do what it naturally does when something meaningful disappears. And when reflection finally hits, it doesn't come as regret right away. It comes as discomfort, then curiosity, then sadness, then awareness. That's the journey. That's why it happens at night. That's why it feels overwhelming, because emotional absence doesn't scream, it echoes. And once that echo begins, it doesn't stop easily. Self-respect is one of the quietest forces in human psychology, yet it creates the deepest impact. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue. It doesn't beg to be seen. And because of that, it is often misunderstood. Many people confuse self-respect with pride, ego, or emotional coldness, but true self-respect is none of those things. It is the decision to stop negotiating your worth when someone repeatedly benefits from your presence without honoring it. When you operate from self-respect, you change the emotional rules of the connection without saying a single word. You stop overgiving. You stop explaining what should already be understood. You stop shrinking yourself to maintain closeness. This shift is not dramatic on the surface, but psychologically it is seismic, because the moment you stop chasing, you stop being predictable. And predictability is comfort. Comfort dulls awareness. Self-respect removes that comfort. A man may not immediately recognize self-respect as value. At first, he may interpret it as distance, mood, or even indifference. But over time, something interesting happens. The absence of your emotional availability forces him to question the reason behind it. And when there is no argument, no blame, no emotional chaos to point at, the mind turns inward. He begins to ask himself, what changed? And that question is the doorway to realization. Self-respect introduces a psychological boundary. Boundaries are not punishments. They are mirrors. They reflect behavior back to the person without commentary. When you stop tolerating emotional inconsistency, you are not trying to teach a lesson. You are simply refusing to abandon yourself. And that refusal communicates something words never could. You know your value even if he doesn't acknowledge it. This is where the emotional impact deepens. A woman who chases says, "Please choose me." A woman who stands in self-respect says nothing, but her energy says, "I already chose myself." That shift disrupts the power dynamic, not because she is trying to gain control, but because she removed herself from a position of need. And nothing unsettles a person more than losing influence they once had without explanation. Self-respect creates psychological distance, and distance creates curiosity. Curiosity leads to focus. Focus leads to emotional attachment. This is not manipulation, it is human nature. People value what they feel they could lose. When you are always available, always forgiving, always understanding, there is no sense of risk. But when you quietly step back, risk enters the picture, and with risk comes attention. What makes self-respect so powerful is that it cannot be argued with. Anger can be dismissed, tears can be ignored, words can be twisted, but dignity stands firm in silence. There is no fight to win against someone who is simply at peace with their decision. That peace creates unease in someone who benefited from your emotional labor without giving the same in return. This is often the stage where confusion sets in. He may feel something is off, but he can't name it. You're not cold, yet you're not available. You're not angry, yet you're no longer chasing. You're still kind, but no longer bending. That contradiction forces the mind to work, and the mind always tries to resolve what it doesn't understand. Self-respect also restores your emotional balance. When you stop overinvesting, you reclaim energy that was being spent on worry, anticipation, and emotional monitoring. You become calmer, more grounded, more centered, and that inner stability changes how you move, speak, and respond. That change is felt. Energy shifts are always felt, even if they are never spoken about. A man senses when a woman no longer needs his validation to feel whole. That realization can trigger insecurity, not because he wants to dominate, but because he is confronted with the possibility that he is no longer the emotional center of her world. That loss of centrality is deeply unsettling. It forces him to reevaluate his position, his effort, and his role. Here's the deeper truth. Self-respect doesn't make you less loving. It makes your love conditional on mutual respect. And when love is no longer unconditional in the face of neglect, it becomes valuable again. Scarcity increases perceived worth, not artificial scarcity, but natural scarcity that comes from honoring your limits. This is why self-respect lingers in the mind. It leaves behind unanswered emotional questions. Why didn't she argue? Why didn't she beg? Why didn't she try to convince me? Why did she walk away so calmly? Those questions replay because there is no clear answer. And when the mind cannot resolve something, it revisits it again and again. At night, when distractions fade, those questions grow louder. That's when the emotional weight appears, not as regret yet, but as realization. The realization that someone who knew their worth chose peace over proximity. And that realization hits differently because it means the loss wasn't accidental, it was intentional. An intentional loss carries emotional consequences. Self-respect doesn't scream, it doesn't threaten. It simply withdraws access. And that withdrawal forces the other person to finally see what they had, only after it's no longer freely available. Men and women experience emotional loss differently, not because one feels more than the other, but because they process emotion through different internal timelines. For many men, emotional awareness does not arrive in the moment of conflict or separation. It arrives later, after the noise has settled. This delay is often misunderstood as indifference, but in reality it is emotional processing happening beneath the surface, away from expression and explanation. In the beginning, when distance appears or communication slows, a man often feels a sense of release rather than pain. There is no immediate emotional collapse. Instead, there's a feeling of space, less expectation, fewer emotional demands, fewer conversations that require vulnerability. This phase can look like moving on quickly, staying busy, or appearing unaffected. But this is not resolution. It is avoidance disguised as calm. Men are conditioned to manage emotion through action and distraction. Work, social activity, routines, and external focus become coping mechanisms. As long as there is something to do, something to chase, or something to fix, the emotional reality remains at bay. This is why the absence of immediate reaction is misleading. The emotional bill has not been canceled. It has simply been postponed. Delayed processing begins when distractions lose their power. When the workday ends, when the phone is quiet, when the night stretches longer than expected. That is when emotion surfaces, not because he invited it, but because there's nowhere left for it to hide. The mind begins to replay moments that once felt insignificant, conversations that ended without resolution, the sound of your voice, the comfort of your presence, the consistency that is no longer there. What makes this realization heavy is that it comes without warning. There is no gradual buildup. One moment he feels fine, the next he feels unsettled. This emotional ambush is what often leads to confusion. He may not even connect the feeling directly to you at first. He just knows something feels off, something feels missing, something doesn't sit right. Men often struggle to name emotions because they were never taught to explore them in depth. Instead of labeling sadness or regret, they experience restlessness, irritation, or fatigue. The body reacts before the mind understands. Sleep becomes difficult. Thoughts loop. There is a sense of weight that cannot be explained logically. This is not weakness, it is emotion finally being acknowledged. The delayed nature of this process is why men often reach out unexpectedly, not during the breakup, not during the silence, but weeks or months later when the emotional realization has matured. By then, the loss has been fully felt, and when loss is fully felt, it carries a different intensity. It is no longer about fixing a situation. It is about mourning what once felt safe. This is also why arguing or explaining rarely works in the moment. During conflict, a man is focused on control, logic, and self-protection. Emotion is secondary. But once the situation is over and control is no longer needed, emotion takes the lead. The heart catches up to what the mind delayed. And when it does, it often arrives all at once. Delayed processing also brings regret, not always dramatic, but persistent. Regret about what was said, what wasn't said, what was assumed, what was taken for granted. The mind begins to form alternative scenarios. If only I had listened more. If only I had shown up differently. If only I had realized sooner. These thoughts are not solutions. They are signs of emotional awakening. This awakening can be deeply uncomfortable. It challenges identity. It forces vulnerability. It highlights emotional blind spots. And because men are rarely encouraged to sit with emotional discomfort, the experience can feel overwhelming. Tears may come without warning, not because of a single thought, but because of accumulated realization. Realization delayed too long to be gentle. The key thing to understand is that delayed processing does not mean lack of feeling. It means feelings were postponed, and postponed emotions tend to arrive heavier, not lighter. They arrive with more force because they were suppressed, ignored, or rationalized away. When they finally surface, they demand attention. This is why silence and distance are so impactful. They allow time for emotional processing to occur naturally, without interference, without pressure, without explanation. When there is no one reminding him how to feel, he is left to discover it on his own. And self-discovered emotion is always stronger than emotion triggered by confrontation. By the time realization sets in, the emotional connection has already been reevaluated internally. He may begin to miss not just you, but the version of himself he was when he felt connected, understood, and emotionally safe. That loss is deeply personal. It is not about possession. It is about identity. And this is where the tears come in. Not dramatic, not public, but quiet, private, late at night. Tears that come from finally understanding what was lost after believing it was easy to let go. Emotional processing may be delayed, but when it arrives, it leaves no room for denial. This delay is not a flaw. It is a pattern. And understanding this pattern allows you to stop chasing immediate validation and start trusting the natural rhythm of emotional realization. Because what is felt later, when fully understood, is often felt deeper than what is felt in the moment. Detachment, when done with peace rather than bitterness, creates one of the strongest psychological imprints a person can leave behind. Most people believe impact comes from emotional intensity, arguments, tears, dramatic exits, or final words meant to be remembered. But the truth is, emotional noise fades. What lingers is what was never explained. When you detach calmly, without blame or chaos, you leave behind emotional silence that the mind cannot easily resolve. The human brain is wired to complete stories. It seeks closure, patterns, and explanations. When a relationship ends with conflict, the mind focuses on the conflict itself. But when it ends or shifts without drama, without anger, without visible pain, the brain has nothing concrete to hold on to. That's where the echo begins. Questions form with no clear answers. Why didn't she fight? Why wasn't she angry? Why did she walk away so peacefully? Those unanswered questions replay because the mind keeps searching for resolution. Peaceful detachment disrupts expectation. If someone expects emotional reactions and doesn't get them, it creates cognitive dissonance. The behavior no longer matches the mental script. That mismatch demands attention. It forces the person to think, revisit, and analyze. And analysis leads to emotional attachment because the mind invests energy into what it cannot understand. This is where detachment becomes powerful, not as a strategy, but as a state of being. When you detach without resentment, you are no longer trying to teach a lesson or provoke a response. You are simply choosing emotional alignment with yourself. That alignment feels different to the other person. It feels final, grounded, and out of reach. And that feeling creates emotional reverberation. An emotional echo is created when presence is removed without emotional residue. There is no anger to blame, no drama to dismiss, no weakness to rationalize, only absence, and absence magnifies memory. Small moments suddenly feel significant. Casual conversations feel meaningful. The comfort of your emotional consistency becomes noticeable only because it is no longer there. At night, when distractions are gone, these echoes grow louder. The mind fills the silence with recollection, not because it wants to suffer, but because it wants to understand. Understanding is the brain's way of restoring balance. But peaceful detachment offers no explanation. There is no emotional trail to follow, and so the mind loops. This looping often brings delayed emotion. Feelings that were suppressed during a relationship surface after it changes. Appreciation arrives late. Gratitude arrives late. Regret arrives late. And because these emotions are discovered internally rather than triggered externally, they feel more authentic and more intense. Detachment with peace also removes emotional leverage. When you no longer seek reaction, the other person loses the ability to influence your emotional state. That loss of influence can be unsettling. It signals that the emotional bond has shifted, not broken through conflict, but loosened through acceptance. And acceptance is harder to undo than anger. Anger keeps connection alive. Even negative attention is still connection. But peace severs the emotional cord quietly. And when the cord is gone, the other person feels it without knowing when or how it happened. That delayed awareness creates longing, not for control, but for reconnection to what once felt emotionally grounding. Another powerful aspect of peaceful detachment is that it removes guilt-based motivation. There is no visible pain to respond to, no tears to soothe, no anger to apologize for. The emotional responsibility shifts inward. The other person must confront their own feelings without being prompted. And self-confrontation is always deeper than externally induced remorse. This is why emotional echoes last longer than emotional explosions. Explosions release energy and then fade. Echoes repeat. They soften, distort, and return again and again. Each repetition adds meaning. Each moment of silence becomes a reminder. Each quiet night becomes a mirror. Peaceful detachment also reframes the narrative. Instead of being remembered as conflict, you are remembered as calm. Instead of being associated with drama, you are associated with emotional stability. And stability is often only valued once it's gone. The mind begins to associate peace with your presence and restlessness with your absence. This creates a subtle emotional pull, not because you demanded it, but because your absence created contrast. Life feels noisier without you, less anchored, less emotionally regulated. And that realization does not come with clarity, it comes with feeling. Detachment does not guarantee reconciliation, and that is not its purpose. Its purpose is emotional integrity. When you detach peacefully, you protect your energy while allowing the truth of the connection to reveal itself. If emotion returns, it is real. If it doesn't, you are already at peace. And that peace is what lingers most. Because when someone realizes they lost access to a calm, grounded presence without conflict, it leaves behind an emotional echo that no explanation could ever silence.